Jordan was ruling over what is now called the West Bank and East Jerusalem until 1967. So they're furious. I mean, I think that's the most polite way of putting it at what's happening in Israel at the moment.
Hassan Nasrallah, as Hezbollah's leader, has warned Israel that his armed forces are ready for anything and that the possibility of total war is realistic in his first public address since the start of the war.
Of our escalation of our front, which is the moral of our enemy towards Lebanon, and that was takes us back into and the morality of our enemy towards Lebanon depends on that escalation of that front. And I'll say it with all the transparency, and in our front all the options are open.
In a speech watched by thousands at a Beirut rally, he called the murder of more than 1,400 Israelis by Hamas, which, like Hezbollah, is a proscribed terrorist organisation in the UK, he called the murder right, wise and just. Israel's army says it's on very, very high alert at its border with Lebanon. Elsewhere in the conflict, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called for more to be done to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 9,000 people have been killed in the Strip since the 7th of October. Richard Spencer, who's in Tel Aviv for The Times, joins me now. Good afternoon, Richard.
Good afternoon.
Do you see that speech as a sign that perhaps the kind of regional spread of this war that people have been talking about and fearing for days may possibly be contained?
I think he's fairly clear. I mean, there's two options now, really. If Netanyahu goes ahead and takes over the entire Gaza Strip and captures and kills the entire Hamas leadership, captures or kills, I should say, the entire military leadership of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, then effectively eradicates what they call the resistance in Gaza, then he's saying that Hezbollah will get involved. And it's very hard to see how he can step back from that. So I think a lot now depends on what happens after the first half of this war is completed. I know that sounds an odd thing to say, but the Israelis themselves have been fairly clear that they're going to take the northern half of Gaza first. They've surrounded Gaza City, the biggest city in Gaza, which is in the north, and various other settlements and towns and refugee camps in the north. They have, if you remember, told all the civilians to go south, and a lot of them have done so. Not all, but a lot of them have done so. There's probably now between 1.5 and 2 million civilians in the southern half of the Gaza Strip. So once assuming that Israel manages to capture Gaza City and those other towns in northern Gaza, they will then have to decide what to do with the south. And presumably the implication of saying all the civilians can be in the south means that some broader discussion has to take place about how if there is going to be an invasion of the south, how it happens. And I think at that point, that is the point at which the Americans, the Qataris and other people step in and say, well, what are the options on the table here?
That's fascinating. But I wonder if you were saying, well, it's very difficult now for Nasrallah to step back from what he said about his conditions for further involvement of Hezbollah. But isn't it also difficult for Israel to step back from its vow to entirely eradicate Hamas? That can't just be done in the north, surely.
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely true. And one presumes that the military leadership of Hamas are now sheltering in the south. I mean, they won't be going down with the ship in Gaza. So, yes, the only thing is that there's always a get-out clause for Israel. There's a get-out clause for Netanyahu, which is the Americans tell us to stop.
Right. Well, let's move on to the
Americans. They do rely on American weapons. So Biden says, I want you to stop. It's very hard for Netanyahu to go down. And he gives him a get-out clause. He said, well, I would have done it, but, look, look what the Americans made me do.
Well, let's talk about the Americans, because, of course, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is in the region again. A subtle change of tone, isn't there, that he talks about everything must be done to protect civilians caught in the crossfire of Hamas's making. I mean, unflinching support for Israel, but subtle shift there, do you think, or not?
Oh yeah, no, the Americans have. I mean, it's a gradual shift. They're putting more and more emphasis on the protection of civilians. I mean, that's partly the nature of the Democratic administration. It's not fully is not and never has been fully enamored of the Netanyahu project for Israel. Like any American presidency or White House administration, when Israel gets attacked, it comes out and gives full moral support and will say we stand by Israel. But you know, they don't like the scale of civilian losses, and on this occasion there was actually political pressure in America over this issue. Which is unusual. I mean, normally America is a fairly united front behind Israel, but there's clearly discontent in parts of the Democratic Party and its base on this issue.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about the risk of this spreading, you know, if Hezbollah does get involved at a future stage. The Secretary of State is also visiting Jordan as he tries to avert an escalation of the war. And what is your assessment of what might come out of that, and what the risk now is of kind of the entire region being engulfed in this?
Yeah, the Jordanians are in a really interesting test case because, of course, they are very close Western allies. King Abdullah of Jordan and Queen Rania, they're very tied into Western diplomatic structures, even military structures, close association between the British military and the Jordanian military, for example. But half their population is Palestinian. Queen Rania is Palestinian herself. And more to the point, they see and have seen ever since the 90s, since King Abdullah's father made peace with Israel and went public on his long relationship with Israeli leaders, which was was a great risk in terms of his standing in the Arab world and his standing with his own people, particularly the Palestinian half of his people. King Abdullah has always felt that risk has not been fully rewarded in terms of Israel and particularly Netanyahu's attitude towards Jordan and also attitude towards the Palestinian population, to which Jordan feels a particular concern, given that Jordan was ruling over what is now called the West Bank and East Jerusalem until 1967. So they're furious. I mean, I think that's the most polite way of putting it at what's happening in Israel at the moment.
Richard Spencer, thank you very much for joining us from Tel Aviv for the Times there.